How do you deal with investor bias when you are an entrepreneur who is fundraising? That's a question that many of you have asked from our Catch the Upswing community. And it is a real practical concern. So, in my last solo episode, I shared about this phenomenon that is documented by research that especially women founders often get asked prevention oriented questions. So, questions that focus on risk, on downside, on fragility. Whereas other founders, especially male founders, get asked promotion-oriented questions. So then it's all about opportunity, vision, scale, and the upside of that potential investment. And so a question that has come up again and again is, okay, like we've, experienced this. It's great to know that this is not just gaslighting. There's real evidence that's substantiated. How do we actually now deal with that knowledge? Like, what can we as founders actually do in practice? And I think what's important is while this is something that women founders experience in particular, it's also if you're a founder perhaps from an emerging market or from another underrepresented background, or perhaps you're like in a sector or building something that's outside kind of more of the convention and what investors have typically seen and recognized as patterns, that is a concern that can come up for you as well. And so, first of all, I think what is really important, what I've seen again and again in practice, is that often these investor questions can really make founders doubt themselves. So instead of doubting the question and really thinking, well, what is behind that question, founders start internalizing the question and doubt themselves more than they doubt the question. And I think that's the first thing I really want to emphasize and want you to take away, that if you're noticing that pattern, it's not imagined, it is real. There's evidence that shows that. But also, this is not about you. And it's very important that you don't start doubting yourself and question yourself more than you actually question the investor question. Now, how do you do that in practice? I've collected some very interesting questions and examples from our global community. And the first question is, okay, what do you do in the moment? That is a question that, for example, Jackie from Denmark asked me. And so I want to share like a simple framework of how you can assess the question in that moment. So let's say you are in a fundraising meeting and you are getting investor questions and you're like, okay, is this now a question I should answer? How do I deal with that? I feel like something is off with that question. So first of all, before you respond, do a quick internal check and ask yourself 3 silent questions. First, is this about my business or is it about my legitimacy? Second, is the investor seriously curious or are they testing me? And then third, if I answer this straight, how will they perceive my company? Is this going to change how my company should be understood? And so answering those 3 questions quickly in your head allows you to analyze the question. And what's really important here is answering the question does not mean that you're accepting the frame. And that's something that I think is really important, that distinction between answering and accepting. Because what I often see in practice is that a lot of founders only discover that distinction when they've kind of already given away too much ground. And so try to make that distinction early on when you look at the question. Let's take a look at some real examples. So I got this really beautiful example from Daisy in Singapore. And she shared an experience with me about like some real questions that she got. And where she's like, okay, I'm following those 3 steps that you mentioned, but how do I now actually know what kind of question this is? So here's a great example. She says, this question seems legitimate. It seems like it's a business question and there's like real curiosity, but also it's putting me into kind of this defensive mode, right? And the question is, for example, an investor asking, isn't this customer segment too niche to scale? So niche here is being used as kind of a proxy for small or for limited, whereas perhaps like her entire growth strategy is actually built around focus, right? So it's about focus. And so how do you then reframe that question? So one way to reframe it could be to say, well, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at this is, XYZ. And I think it's like this split of a second in that moment when you have to decide, okay, do I answer this? Do I reframe? Or do I have to push back? So it's kind of, analyzing it within that moment and determining what you actually do. And I think what I also want to emphasize here is you're not being evasive if you are reframing that question. You're being more accurate, right? Because in your mind, this isn't actually like the real question. There seems to be like an implicit misunderstanding. And so you're reframing that question. And then also very interesting is how the investor responds to that reframe, because that itself gives you data about how the investor thinks about this. And an example of this niche one, so something that I see very often is, for example, that female fund managers who have a gender lens investing strategy get challenged by investors saying, well, doesn't this mean that you have a niche strategy and you're only focusing on 50% of the population on women? And actually the reframe is to say, well, if currently only 2% of venture capital is actually going to female founders, then that tells you that currently the conventional model is to look at only 50% of the market. And so by having a gender lens investing strategy, we're actually looking at the other 50% that's currently being ignored, right? So it's a very different way of looking at the same question, or the particular strategy here. So next question I got, and this is an interesting one. A quick note of thanks and a small invitation. If you're enjoying this podcast, subscribing is one of the easiest ways to support the work and help these conversations travel further. I really appreciate you being here. This is from Julia in Colombia. And she's saying, well, what if the question gets personal? So what if it is a question that really feels personal? Do I have to answer? How do I deal with that? And I think with personal questions, the thing is, often if you answer it directly, it almost means that you're kind of like implicitly accepting an assumption that you shouldn't have to accept, which is the assumption that somehow your personal life is a liability for your business, right? And so you shouldn't have to justify your personal life. And in that sense, I guess, again, let's take a typical example, and I've heard that from several of you, interestingly, both from men and women, is this question about parenthood. So what if the investor is asking about parenthood? So let's say, kind of the investor question is focusing on the company, but like they're weaving in this question of parenthood. So one way to, kind of gently reframe it or answer it without accepting or justifying your personal life or, accepting that this is somehow a liability would be to say, like most founders, I've built systems and a team that allows me to delegate appropriately and really focus on the company's priorities. So for example, if at this point in time, what really matters is, let's say, strategy or execution, that is what I'm spending my time on, and that is how I focus, right? If you want to be firmer and kind of go one step further, you could say, I manage my business as any other founder, and that is through prioritization, delegation, and strong teams. And it might be more useful to actually focus now on our operating model, right? Which has like a little bit of more of assertiveness, but it's also like still a professional way to answer the question and then get back to the actual business questions. So a simple rule here is, if the question tests your business, answer it. If it tests your legitimacy, then reframe it or push back. And then many have asked me about how to deal with rejection. And that is, it seems like really something that a lot of founders are thinking about, because we've heard on this podcast before, you hear no so many times until you get to that one yes. So how do you actually deal with that rejection? And I've got several questions here. One is from Brian, who's currently in Berlin, is a founder there. And he's asking, how do you kind of avoid internalizing that no? How do you still believe in yourself, stay optimistic? How do you deal with that rejection? And so How I like to see it is that investor rejections are data. If you reframe the investor question and they get curious, that's a good signal, right? On the other hand, if you do set a boundary and they get kind of defensive, that is also a signal and that gives you data. So not every no is a failure. In fact, I would even say no is a failure. It's really data and it helps you to reflect and learn, right? So some of those no's may actually be an early warning signal because it's not just the investor doing due diligence on you, it's also you getting to know the investor and seeing if there is indeed a fit. Do you really want to spend the next 5 to 7 years very closely with that investor, right? Do you want those investors on your cap table, or would you actually prefer to have a different investor because you're seeing that already now their attention and it's not really a fit with what you're looking for? That is data. And so even if you realize that you actually really wanted that investor, that you feel there is great alignment and they still say no, well, then it's an opportunity to learn, right? What was it this time that wasn't convincing for them? Maybe it wasn't even you, maybe it was timing or something else. So, how can you use that data to inform your future fundraising? Like, really see this as an opportunity to reflect and learn, and don't let it discourage you. So, in a nutshell, difficulty in fundraising does not mean that your idea somehow lacks value. It says often more about pattern recognition by the investor, about timing, and ultimately about power than it says about you and your business idea. I think for me, the real value is being able to walk away from a fundraising meeting or an investor interaction and being able to say, I answered honestly, I did not shrink, and I didn't internalize something that wasn't mine. So that for me matters far more than any single pitch. And that is really what I would, love to encourage you to take away with you from this episode. I want to briefly highlight a framework that many investors use when thinking seriously about gender lens investing. The 2X criteria developed by 2X Global are a global industry standard that help investors assess how capital advances gender equality in practice. The criteria focus on companies founded, led, and owned by women, that create quality employment for women, and that provide products and services that improve the lives of women and girls, as well as how financial institutions and funds can make gender equality really a value driver across their portfolios. They're designed to translate gender equality into concrete investment decision-making.